On the night of August 15th, 1971, millions of Americans gathered around their televisions. President Richard Nixon appeared live from the Oval Office, calm and deliberate, addressing the nation about something few truly understood. But everyone would soon feel. With a brief statement, he changed the foundation of the global economy. I have directed Secretary Connolly to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Temporarily. That single word, meant to reassure, marked the end of an era that had lasted for centuries. From that night forward, money would never again be tied to something real. The dollar, once backed by gold, became backed only by trust and by power. The age of real money had ended before Nixon's announcement. The world still lived under a promise born from the ashes of World War II, the Bretton Woods system. Under it, the U.S. dollar was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce, and all other currencies were pegged to the dollar. It was elegant, stable, and symbolic. The United States held most of the world's gold reserves. The dollar was as good as gold, and the rest of the world accepted it as such. For a generation, that system worked. Factories boomed, global trade expanded, and nations rebuilt. The gold standard seemed eternal, the anchor that kept the monetary world sane. But beneath that stability, cracks were forming. The promise was simple but impossible. Every dollar abroad could, in theory, be exchanged for gold held in American vaults. Yet, as the 1950s and 60s unfolded, the U.S. printed far more dollars than it had gold to cover. The reason was both political and human. The American government had found something irresistible, the ability to spend without limit. The Cold War demanded weapons, wars, and welfare. Vietnam, the space race, the Great Society, all financed with dollars, not discipline. By the late 1960s, the illusion was wearing thin. Foreign governments, especially France under Charles de Gaulle, began demanding gold in exchange for their dollar holdings. De Gaulle even sent a French battleship to New York in 1965 to physically retrieve France's gold from the Federal Reserve. The gesture was theatrical and prophetic because the United States, for all its power, no longer had enough gold to honor its promise. In the background, the world was quietly panicking. Banks in Europe were converting their reserves. Economists warned of collapse, and U.S. officials scrambled for options. Inflation at home was rising. Confidence abroad was falling. The gold standard, the system that had kept global finance anchored for generations, was sinking under its own contradictions. And so, Nixon chose the unthinkable. In his televised speech, he presented the move as a matter of national defense, an act to protect the American worker and stabilize the dollar. He even threw in a freeze on wages and prices to sound decisive. But what he really did was something far more profound. He untied money from reality. Until that day, every paper dollar had been a claim on something physical, a tangible ounce of gold resting in Fort Knox. After that day, the dollar became something abstract, a promise of value that existed only because people believed it did. The moment Nixon spoke those words, money became an idea. The immediate reaction was confusion, followed by relief. The markets did not crash. People still bought bread and gasoline. Life went on. But something invisible had changed forever. For the first time in modern history, the world's dominant currency floated free, unanchored by any metal, unbound by any limit. Governments could now print as much as they wished, spend as much as they dared, and manipulate value at will. The age of faith-based money had begun. At first, few noticed what that meant. The new system, later called fiat currency, worked surprisingly well. Freed from gold, economies could expand faster. Central banks could manage growth by creating credit. Politicians could promise more, without worrying about what sat in their vaults. But behind the prosperity lurked a paradox. If money no longer represented gold, what did it represent? The answer was unsettling. It represented debt. Every new dollar came into existence as someone's obligation, a bond, a loan, a promise to repay. The wealth of nations was no longer measured by what they possessed, but by how much they owed. The system had inverted. Money was no longer the end of a transaction. It was the beginning of one. The world adjusted quickly. Banks expanded their lending. Corporations leveraged themselves. Governments spent freely. The 1970s saw an explosion in global finance, but also chaos. Without gold to restrain them, currencies began to float. Exchange rates swung wildly. Oil shock sent prices soaring. Inflation devoured savings. What had once been stable became unpredictable. The rules of the game were rewritten, and only those who understood them early profited. The great irony was that Nixon's temporary suspension became permanent. The United States never went back to gold. No nation did. The promise of convertibility was gone forever. The dollar, once a receipt for metal, became a symbol of faith. Faith not in gold, but in government. Still, the system held, because America found a new foundation for its paper empire: oil. In the years after Nixon's decision, the United States struck an agreement with Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing nations. In exchange for military protection, they would sell their oil exclusively in dollars. Every country that needed oil now needed dollars. The petrodollar was born, and with it, a new kind of gold standard not based on metal, but on energy and power. The dollar remained supreme not because it was backed by gold, but because it was backed by necessity. The rest of the world adjusted to this quiet revolution. Central banks built their reserves in dollars. Global trade relied on them, and debt, once a shadow of wealth, became the new currency of growth. By the end of the 1970s, the world had entered a new era, an era where money no longer meant anything fixed, yet controlled everything. Economies rose and fell based on confidence, not metal. Inflation became a political weapon, and the concept of value became something governments could manufacture with a printer. If you want to understand how the world's most powerful currency stopped being real, and why that decision still shapes your life today, make sure to subscribe and stay until the end of this story. Because what came after Nixon's announcement wasn't just a change in monetary policy. It was the birth of a new illusion, one that still defines a modern world. The year is 1973. 2 years after Nixon severed gold from the dollar, the illusion of stability began to waver. Oil prices quadrupled, inflation erupted, and for the first time in modern history, money seemed to move without rules. Governments scrambled, economists argued, and ordinary citizens felt the silent weight of a transformation they couldn't name. The golden anchor of the world's financial system was gone, and now the seas were open. The end of the gold standard had set something ancient free: human imagination. Money, once chained to metal, now existed purely as numbers, mutable, limitless, unbacked by anything but confidence. To economists, this was liberation. To historians, it was the start of an empire built on debt. The 1970s and 1980s became the decades of experimentation. Nations that had lived for centuries within the hard limits of gold now discovered that they could create value out of nothing. With a pen stroke, a central bank policy, or a new bond issuance. Central banks became alchemists. They could expand or contract the supply of money at will, manipulating entire economies with decisions made behind closed doors. The idea of sound money, money that could not be printed without cost, vanished. What replaced it was monetary policy, a polite phrase for the ability to create money by decree. And with it came a new kind of addiction. Governments discovered that growth could be bought. Debt was no longer a constraint. It was fuel. A generation of politicians realized they could promise everything, from social programs to wars, without raising taxes. The money printer became the new god of prosperity. But prosperity built on printing had a price. Inflation devoured wages, and savings lost meaning. If gold had once been the conscience of money, that conscience was now gone. In 1980, the symbol of that shift appeared on television screens everywhere. Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker, a towering man with horn-rimmed glasses, announcing interest rates above 20%. His goal was to tame the monster unleashed by Nixon's decision: inflation. The cost was brutal. Recessions, bankruptcies, and unemployment soared. But Volcker succeeded in proving one thing. Even without gold, governments could still create fear and faith through policy. Money had become psychological. By the 1990s, the system had stabilized, but its nature had changed forever. The dollar was no longer a certificate of gold. It was a certificate of belief. Markets rose not on production, but on perception. The economy had turned digital before the internet even existed. An invisible web of credits, debts, and expectations. What mattered wasn't metal, but trust in institutions, interest rates, and central bankers. And as technology advanced, the illusion deepened. Money became nothing more than light. Signals traveling through cables, stored in databases, appearing on screens. It could be created or destroyed at the push of a button. The 2008 financial crisis was the natural consequence of this new world. Banks had built towers of paper promises upon promises. Derivatives, mortgages, and debt stacked on top of one another like a Jenga tower of trust. When it began to wobble, the truth was exposed. The global economy was not based on gold production or labor. It was based on confidence, and confidence alone. When that confidence cracked, everything trembled. Trillions vanished overnight, not because gold was stolen, but because belief evaporated. And in the ashes, governments did what they had learned to do best since 1971. They printed. Central banks flooded the world with liquidity. Trillions of new dollars, euros, and yen entered circulation. The economy recovered on paper. But something fundamental had shifted again. The line between reality and illusion blurred beyond recognition. The gold standard had once limited the greed of men by the weight of the earth. Without it, that limit no longer existed. Debt soared to unimaginable heights. The world's total debt, public and private, exceeded $300 trillion, 3 times global GDP. And yet, markets thrived. Stocks hit record highs. Real estate boomed. The illusion of prosperity continued because no one wanted to look too closely. In a strange twist of fate, the world had traded one kind of faith for another. Once, we believed in gold because it was scarce, immutable, eternal. Now, we believe in governments, even as they print away scarcity, stability, and meaning. This new system, known as fiat money, has no expiration date until trust itself expires. And that is its greatest vulnerability. Because if money is only valuable as long as people believe in it, then the entire world economy rests not on vaults or resources, but on psychology. Confidence has become the world's most precious commodity. When trust fades, currencies fall. When trust grows, debt becomes invisible. The cycle repeats endlessly. Each generation born into a system that seems solid, yet floats on air. Still, the illusion has its architects. The modern central banker is not a goalkeeper, but a storyteller. His words, carefully chosen, move markets more than metal ever did. When a Federal Reserve chair whispers about rates, trillions react instantly. It's not the weight of coins that drives economies. It's the tone of speech. We no longer live in the age of gold, but in the age of narrative. The irony is profound. In abandoning the gold standard to free itself from limits, humanity may have created a system even more fragile, one dependent on constant faith, constant motion, and constant illusion. The machine can never stop, because if it does, people might notice there's nothing behind the curtain. And yet, the story endures. Nations still trade in dollars. Banks still lend, borrowers still borrow, and most people still trust the digits on their screens. The system works, as long as we all pretend it does. The last time the world saw a monetary collapse on this scale was in Weimar Germany, when paper money lost all meaning. But today's collapse, if it comes, will look different. It won't happen through hyperinflation or empty shelves. It will happen when people stop believing in the story, when they stop believing that the paper or the code represents something real. In a way, Nixon's announcement in 1971 was not the death of the gold standard. It was the birth of belief as currency. We moved from a world measured in ounces to one measured in confidence. From a tangible standard to an emotional one. From gold, the metal that doesn't rust, to trust, the emotion that always does. And maybe that's why, decades later, we still search for something solid. Some people turn to real estate, others to cryptocurrencies, and others still to gold itself. Each is a different version of the same ancient desire, to hold something that feels real in a world of illusions. Because when money stopped being real, value itself became a story, and we all became its believers.